Okay, there I see it. Thanks a lot. Great.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. We will start shortly. Thank you. Hey. Hello, my name is John Fisher, and this is The Scammer. A stunning piece of fabric draped in the foreground. On the other side, a window, open, natural light pouring in. The figures lit by natural light. The intricacy of painting, the detail, the attention to the intimacy, the stunning colors, blues and greens and reds. This is the world of Vermeer. And this is a story of the man who painted Vermeers, not Johannes Vermeer, but a man named Han van Meegeren. He was a Dutch painter himself. And here he is, looking so proud. Han van Meegeren, he forged the paintings of Vermeer. Now, one thing you have to understand about Vermeer is, I firmly believe that you can see a lot of paintings in books. You can learn a lot about looking at paintings in books. I don't think you always have to see them in museums to enjoy them, but that is not the case with Vermeer. You've got to see these in the flesh. They are shocking. Now, this is a real Vermeer, and it is like an intricate, detailed, loving, religious portrait of a lace maker. Look at that. The light pouring in from one side, the stunning colors, the fabric in the foreground, it's all there. And look at her, almost a religious devotion to what she's doing. These can be seen in books, they can be seen on screen, but they can't be appreciated except in the flesh. They are amazing. He was a golden age Dutch painter from the 17th century. Here is my favorite. This one's the best, The Astronomer. Look at this. Look at that blue cloak, something he was famous for. There's the fabric in the foreground, the light coming in from one side, the natural lighting, the delicacy, the intricacy of detail. And here's something I never hear talked about with Vermeer. What I love about him, the softness of the gestures. Look at those gestures. He's gripping the table with one of his hands, but it's a very, very gentle grip. It's like somebody who loves tables. He has to grip the table, but he doesn't want to hurt the table. And even more stunning is the way he's holding the globe. This is the way an astronomer holds a globe, like he loves a globe. It's like he's caressing it. This is what I love about Vermeer. And these are real ones. These are not forgeries. These are the authentic thing. He's caressing that globe. I love Vermeer. And knowing Vermeer led me to find out about Han van Meegeren. So this is a tale of World War II and of the great economic crash of 2008 in this country. So it's both a tale historical and personal. It covers something that happened in Holland and something that happened in my life and how the two illuminate each other. Both of them were disasters. And in both of them, I experienced the dislocations of disaster, the dislocation of personality, of belief, of individuals from one another, the dislocations of disasters. The World War II part deals with Holland, which is where Han van Meegeren was a painter at the time of the German invasion. In 1940, the Germans invaded Holland. They suddenly appeared. Now, the Dutch weren't sure that the Germans were going to invade Holland because in the First World War, they hadn't. They bypassed Holland, but the Germans didn't want to leave anything in their rear. Hitler wanted to wipe out all those countries. He didn't want any enemies behind him when he went for France, so he invaded Holland. On the first day of the invasion, before the tanks had even rolled into Holland, Hermann Goering, the Reichsmarshal, the second in command, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, in all of Europe, who was also the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, ruthlessly bombed Rotterdam. This beautiful Dutch city was flattened. Here's a picture of it, flattened on the first day of the invasion as a lesson to the Dutch. This gorgeous city, flattened. Look at that. All that's left is the husk of the cathedral. The city was eventually rebuilt. And this is what it looks like now, completely modern. Many people think this is a fake, a forgery. This isn't the real Rotterdam. Rotterdam had been flattened and it was rebuilt as a modernist center. And a lot of people don't like it. They think it's a forgery. Well, the invasion of Holland took the Nazis 5 days and then Holland collapsed. It fell. Rotterdam had been flattened, and that was a lesson. It was to snap the Dutch out of it. And they got the lesson. They wanted to protect their cities, The Hague, Rotterdam, Delft. They wanted to protect them, so they surrendered. Smart move. Unfortunately, they were hopeful. They were hopeful that the Nazi occupation wouldn't be that bad, but there were some Dutch who were not hopeful. And on the first day of the invasion, 150 Dutch Jews committed suicide. They knew what was coming. They knew what the Nazis were going to bring. The concentration camps, the gas chambers, the ovens. 150 Dutch Jews committed suicide on the first day of the invasion. So Holland, although it might not have been aware of it, was poised for a disaster, the Nazi occupation. In 2007, I was on a roll. I enjoyed 2 years of hits. At the theater, I was putting on show after show, and people loved them. I was writing them, I was directing them, I was producing them, I was acting in them, and the critics were adoring. They were writing great reviews. The audiences were happy. People were donating money. It was going really, really well. And I was working with one of my favorite actors of all time. His name was Miles, and we met working on another show, and it was something that somebody else had written. But when that show was over, I invited him to come to the theater and act in my shows. And I put him in show after show after show because he was so talented, so hardworking, so fun to work with. He could do comedy, he could do tragedy, supporting roles, leading roles. He could sing. He was great. So I was on a big role in 2007. And I too, though I didn't know it, I was poised for a disaster. Hans van Meegeren, the great forger, the man who made Vermeers. He wasn't Vermeer, but he made them nonetheless. He was born in 1889, and he was born into a great tradition of Dutch artists. From the golden age in the 17th century, Holland had produced some of the greatest artists of all time. My favorite, my all-time favorite, was always Rembrandt. Rembrandt van Rijn. I love this guy. Now, this painting is in the Legion of Honor. Look at this guy. I love this. This is from my favorite period of Rembrandt, the early period when he painted these wonderful portraits. Look at the delicacy of that. Everything is some shade of brown, tan, dark brown, light brown, flesh tones. It's magnificent. And this guy was a militia member. So there he is holding his gun proudly. And look how the light catches his face and then spills onto his tunic. I love this stuff. And Rembrandt is an artist I feel you can discover in pictures, in books. But if you go up to the Legion and see this painting, it is stunning. And he was an early favorite of mine. Also in the 17th century in Holland, a little bit after Rembrandt was, of course, the man of the hour, Vermeer. Here it is again. There it is, the fabric in the foreground. Do you see it? The light streaming in through the windows, the natural light, the delicacy of treatment, the delicacy of gesture. And there is that parquet floor with a forced perspective disappearing into the distance. Now, these paintings you got to see in person. You really got to see them because they just shimmer like jewels in a way that no picture can capture. Here's another one. Magnificent. All the features are there of his classical period. This is Vermeer at his best. The rich fabrics. You see the fabric there in the foreground on the chair that's turned around, the light coming in from a window. This one's stained glass. He was getting more and more sophisticated. The delicacy of gesture, the way people relate to one another, almost in a religious way. There's devotion between them. And those great parquet floors disappearing off into the distance, creating a forced perspective. I love Vermeer. And again, you got to see him in person. You got to go there and see him. And there are only 35 of them, because he wasn't popular in his own time. He was only rediscovered in the 19th century. And the first painting of his that was rediscovered was bought for 2 guilders, the equivalent of $2. He was nobody, and now he's worth millions. Here then is Frans Hals, a successor of Rembrandt's and Vermeer's. Now this guy is like a cartoonist. Look at that. The fun, the excitement of this painting. This is called The Lute Player, and he captured cartoon-like figures, all the energy. Now, you don't have to see these in person, but it's a great treat to do it, because when you see them, you see how delicately they're painted. It's almost like the brush barely touches the canvas. He's an impressionist painter 300 years before the Impressionists. I love the energy of his paintings, the excitement. They're for children, they're for young adults, they're for old adults who just want to have fun. Frans Hals. Now, it wasn't just the Golden Age. It wasn't just the 17th century in Holland that created great artists. They were created all the way through the 19th century, and this guy is the star. He's probably the star of all time in terms of Western painting. There he is. Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh. I love this painting. I discovered this painting when I was 5 years old in a book. Look at that. It's called The Potato Eaters. The simplicity of these people. He went into people's houses. These were farmers, and he studied them. This is so real. Never had people like this been portrayed in a painting. Look at them all eating the potatoes. Some of them look bored. Some of them look like they're thinking of things, imagining things in their head. Some of them are suspicious of each other. Some of them look at each other with a lot of amusement. It's an amazing, it's like a whole play right there. Vincent van Gogh. And again, you can enjoy this guy in books, but when you see them in person, you see the globs of paint he applied. And he too was not popular in his lifetime, but he was a brilliant Dutch artist. And Dutch brilliance extended all the way into the 20th century. And here is one of my favorites, Piet Mondrian. I love this guy. He was one of my favorite moderns because there was no pretension about him. There was no complexity. There was nothing ugly about him, no intellectuality. He was just fun. This is called Broadway Boogie Woogie. It was painted in 1943 when he was living in New York City. And he looked down on the streets of New York, and this is what he saw. It's like what a child would see. The grid, the little dots are the cars moving, all the excitement of New York captured in abstraction. He'd extended Dutch painting into abstraction, and brilliantly. I love his stuff. And again, you don't have to see it in person, but if you do, it's a treat. It can be enjoyed even on a piece of paper like this. This was oil painting brought into the modern era. These were brilliant painters, and they all inspired in one way or another Han van Meegeren, except Mondrian, who was a contemporary, but I bet he knew about him. They inspired him somehow. Somehow they inspired him. He wanted to study art, but it would be in defiance of his father because his father was a school teacher, a Catholic school teacher, and he thought that the bohemian lifestyle was a waste of time. It was sinful. So Van Meegeren went off on his own. And he had his first show in 1917, and everybody saw that he was a genius of portraiture. This is him. This is a self-portrait. Look at this. I love this painting. It's magnificent. Look at this. He's got such technical skill, such deftness with the brush, but also he gets the psychology. Look at this guy. This is him. This is him. Look at him. He almost looks angry, suspicious, determined, bohemian, a majesty in his figures. And it wasn't just people like him that he painted. He painted the wealthy. He actually got a lot of commissions painting wealthy people. And here's this wonderful portrait of his. I love this portrait. Here's this guy dressed to go to dinner, right? In this beautiful red jacket with the bow tie, right? And he's staring at the camera, right? Right? He's being painted. He's staring, but he looks a little suspicious, or maybe flirtatious, or maybe he's bored, or maybe he's excited. We don't know, but we want to know because Van Meegeren was brilliant at capturing the psychology of his sitters. He was a wonderful portraitist, and he made a lot of money doing it. This is probably his most famous painting of all time, and one of the most famous Dutch paintings in history. It's called the Fawn. Now, this was painted at the same time as those other ones, 1917, and he was given the challenge of coming up with a painting in 10 minutes, and this is what he whipped out. Now, it's a beautiful, beautiful picture, but it became one of the most popular paintings in all of Dutch history because 1 out of every 5 households in Holland had to have a picture of this on their wall. Why? Because of the story behind it. It wasn't just that it was a beautiful picture, which it is, but he said that this wasn't any fawn. It was the fawn of the Princess Juliana. Yes. She was the most popular royal in Holland. She was like their Princess Di. And when they saw that this was her fawn, when they heard that story, everybody wanted it. And it appeared on everybody's wall. This was the power of Van Meegeren. He was doing great. He had a great facility with art, but he also understood the importance of a great story. The story behind the picture. Because if the story was good enough, it made the picture even that much more valuable. And this painting became incredibly valuable. He had his next art show in 1922, and now he was excited because he wasn't going to do what other people wanted to do. He wasn't going to paint fawns. He wasn't going to paint portraits. He was going to paint what he wanted to do. And this was getting back to his father, because his father must have had a huge influence on him somehow, because his next show was a show of religious art. Here is Jesus surrounded by his disciples. Yes, it was all religious because that's what he wanted to paint. Unfortunately, the critics hated it. The professional art community hated it. Everybody hated it. He was still selling a lot of paintings, but he had no respect from the art community because they didn't want this anymore. They wanted Mondrian. They wanted abstraction. They wanted what things were coming out of Russia, like Kandinsky, Picasso. They wanted something modern, and he was giving them something old. But it was something he believed in. He couldn't believe that he was rejected for painting what he wanted to paint. Isn't that what Van Gogh did? Isn't that what Vermeers did? No. It was a rejection, outright. The critics hated it. And because of his failure in that show, he said that was his excuse for becoming a forger. He wanted to get revenge. He wanted to show all the critics, all the experts, he wanted to show everybody that he could paint anything and he could fool them. So he was going to forge art, and he was motivated by revenge. He was bitter. He was angry at the critics, and he was going to get back by pulling a big trick on him. Now, is that true? Is that really the reason that he became a forger? Maybe. But that show was in 1922, when the critics didn't like his religious art. Then Meegeren started forging in 1920. Yes, before he had been rejected by the critics. Why? Well, probably because he wanted money. Yes, he wanted to make lots of money. Now, there was a long tradition of forgery in Holland, all over Europe, really, but especially in Holland, because people loved to collect Rembrandts, Vermeers. They loved it, loved it, loved it. So there was a long tradition of forgery in Holland. Forgeries being sold. And who did they sell a lot to? They sold them to guileless Americans. Americans were not so set on making sure that everything was authentic, that everything had a provenance, that everything was real. They just wanted to buy up art because they needed some class, right? Because a lot of Americans became rich overnight. They weren't like Europeans. They didn't inherit a bunch of money. No, they got rich overnight on really tacky things like oil. That's dirty, coal, railroads, steel. These aren't attractive things. They're not sexy things. So they wanted to have something sexy. They wanted to have something that made them legitimate. So they wanted a bunch of European art, and they weren't that discerning. They just wanted to get it. I love American fortunes. I'm always so impressed with how Americans make money. When I was growing up in Tiburon, this guy built this massive house on 4 empty lots, and it faced the bay. It faced San Francisco. It was one of the best lots in Tiburon. And it was a weird house. It looked like something that happened on the moon. There was all these like space age rocks fitted together, and it looked like where people lived were like modules that had crashed into the rocks. It was really wild and crazy. And I said to my mother, I said, how did that guy make all that money? And she said, oh, he's seatbelts. I said, what do you mean seatbelts? Well, he invented this, the cross-the-shoulder seatbelt. I love that. Americans will invent anything and make tons of money off of it. And I had my own experience with a rich American who invented anything, made tons of money off of it, and wanted to have a glorious art foundation, art museum, and that was Barnes and the Barnes Foundation. I always wanted to go to the Barnes Foundation. I'd read so much about it. It's supposed to be one of the best collections of European art in the United States, in the world. It's incredible. Now, Barnes was really interesting because how did he make his money? He made his money by coming up with a cure for gonorrhea. Now, how do you talk about that at a party? You can't talk about how you made your money curing gonorrhea. Yeah. So what do? You get a bunch of art, a bunch of European art, and you throw big parties, and that's what you talk about, the European art. I love it. I love that story. So he built this big museum out in suburban Philadelphia. And after he died, he left a will that said, this museum has to stay exactly the way I left it. Exactly the way. The same paintings hung in the exact same way, exactly the way it's seen. All my fixtures, it all has to be there exactly the way I left it. Well, his family were frustrated because nobody wanted to go to suburban Philadelphia to see art. They wanted to see art in the middle of Philadelphia. So finally, after years of trying and huge debates in Philadelphia, everybody was so angry, they got permission to build a new Barnes Foundation in the middle of Philadelphia. And they hired these incredible architects to do it, a completely modern building. And I love this building. I was so interested in this building. I wanted so much to see it not because I was interested in forgeries. I didn't know what was in the museum. I thought all of the things in the museum were real. I thought that they'd just be real things. But in the back of my mind, I'd heard a lot about the forgeries, always being sold to Americans, rich Americans, over-rich Americans who weren't discerning. Here's a forgery. This is Rembrandt. Looks like Rembrandt, doesn't it? Yeah, just like Rembrandt? No, it's a forgery. And one of my favorite paintings ever was The Man with the Golden Hat by Rembrandt. Guess what? It's not Rembrandt. It's not him. It's somebody else. Everybody was tricked. And sometimes the best paintings weren't even by the people they said they were by. But that's not why I wanted to go to the Barnes Foundation. Why I wanted to go to the Barnes Foundation is I wanted to see this incredible piece of contemporary architecture and the incredible collection in it, which I'd heard so much about. So one day I was in New York, and I got a zip car and I drove to Philadelphia. Now I thought Philadelphia was really close. It was just like that far on the map, but it turned out it was 2 hours on that freeway. Wait, no, it's not a freeway, it's a toll road, you know, where you have to throw the coins, that weird East Coast thing. So I drove all the way to Philadelphia to see the Barnes Foundation. And when I got there, I loved it. even before I got out of the car, I could see I was going to have a great time because here was this incredible work of contemporary art, contemporary architecture by a team called Williams and Scene. Look at that. It's great. It's so modern. It was made of this beautiful stone cut in panels, and it had this huge glass thing on top of it to let light in. For years, the paintings of the foundation, the Barnes Foundation, weren't even seen because there was no light in that dusty old museum in the suburbs. Now there'd be plenty of light to see the paintings. I walked all around the museum. I walked all around it, and I loved it. It was amazing. And then I went inside. It cost $20 to get in. I thought, well, that's kind of steep, but anyway, who cares? This must be one of the great collections. And I finally got inside and I saw it. The deal had been that they could build a new building in the middle of Philadelphia, but they had to hang the paintings exactly the way Barnes had said long ago. They had to be hung exactly the same paintings, exactly the same fixtures, exactly the way he'd hung them. Yes? So I went in and there were the paintings and I saw them and it was weird. It was so weird. You see, Barnes wasn't just obsessed with European painting, he was also obsessed with fixtures. So all the paintings were stacked on the wall, these beautiful green walls with these paintings stacked on them, which looked really cool, but they were interspersed with weird old fixtures, just like rusty hinges and weather vanes and locks off of doors. It was weird. It's like, who cares about these fixtures? It was the strangest collection of paintings I've ever seen, but I didn't care. I was like, okay, the guy was crazy. He's crazy. He's insane. Fine, fine. They're respecting what he wanted to do. Great. I'm going to look at the paintings. I walked up to the first one. It was supposed to be a Raphael, and I looked at it. It looked pretty good, but didn't quite look right. And then I looked at the plate and it said formerly attributed to Raphael. What? I looked at the Botticelli, formerly attributed to Botticelli. What? They had a Da Vinci. Nobody has a Da Vinci. It said formerly attributed to Da Vinci. More than half the paintings in the Barnes collection weren't real. He bought a bunch of bad art. Back when people like Meegeren were selling phony art, he bought a bunch of lousy art. I was appalled. I was looking at rusty hinges and a lot of the art wasn't even real. And I knew they had a lot that was, but they couldn't show it because they had to show the paintings that he liked. It was the most bizarre museum experience I've ever had. It was so disappointing. I walked out there so frustrated. All those forgeries. It was tacky. They weren't good forgeries like the man with the gold helmet, which is great. I mean, it's a forgery, but it's great. No, they were just like kind of off and not that great. But somebody had told them it's a Botticelli. And it looked like a Botticelli to everybody at the time. So he bought it. How bizarre. So I left there really frustrated. But I was in Philadelphia and I wanted to have a good time. So I went down to the riverside and I found the USS Olympia, that old battle cruiser that won the Battle of Manila Bay. Yeah. Admiral Dewey's flagship. Yeah. And then there's this World War II submarine next to it. And these were real. These weren't phony. And I went all over them and it was really cheap. And so I had a good time in Philadelphia. So why was Van Meegeren doing this? Was it really to get revenge? No, money was his motivation. He knew there was a ton of money to be made painting people, especially obscure people like Vermeer. There are only 35 Vermeers in the world. If he could add to that, he would make a lot of money. Why do he want money? Because he wanted to be rich, obviously. He liked to drink. He liked to get drunk. He was a partier. I mean, he had a wife and 2 kids. I mean, he was divorced from the wife, but he loved his kids. And he had a second wife. He loved her, but he loved the ladies. And he wanted to have it all. And that would cost money. It would cost a lot of money. So meanwhile, in the present, we kept doing our plays. We were just zipping along doing plays. And Miles, this wonderful actor, he and I became friends, as we worked on all these projects. And he told me that he'd had sort of his drinking, partying phase, big time. I said, oh, really? He said, yeah, no. And then I got into AA and I don't drink anymore. And that really impressed me that he really pulled himself together. And I saw that he used all that darkness in his life on stage because he could play tragedies, he could play comedy. I could see that there was a lot going on in this very, very straightforward guy from the past that he used on stage. I love hearing stories about how people got into AA. What made you finally decide to stop drinking, to get into AA? And usually people tell some horrible story like, suddenly I was in the back of a squad car and cops were beating me. And I'm like, that's horrible. But Miles's story was so charming. He said he woke up in Vienna and he didn't know how he'd gotten there. And then he realized he didn't have any pants. He woke up pantless in Vienna, no idea how he got there. So somehow he got home and got some pants and got himself into a program. And he had become a really reliable guy and a wonderful person to work with. And I never knew him back then. I never knew anything about all that. And I wrote him roles and he always nailed it. He always nailed the roles, role after role after role. I was like thinking, what am I gonna do with Miles? What am I gonna do with Miles? How am I gonna use him? He was great. And then we did a play together that we both acted in. It was called A Question of Attribution. And it was about this British art expert. He's a historical character, Sir Anthony Blunt. And I played Anthony Blunt. And it turns out that he was a spy. For 50 years, he was a spy for the Russians. And he worked with the Queen. He was the Queen's art curator. And he knew everything about what was going on in Britain. And he told it to the Russians. And Miles played this guy named Chubb, who works for MI5, the British CIA, and he's trying to expose my character. And they have this big discussion about art and what is authentic and what is a lie, right? Because a spy is a lie, right? So they have this big discussion about art, and who do they talk about but Van Meegeren? They have this whole conversation about Van Meegeren and how that is an analogy for what it is to be a spy in Britain, giving things to the Russians, to deceive people, to be a forgery, because that's what Anthony Blunt was, a forgery. It was a great play. It's written by Alan Bennett. It's wonderful, and we had a great experience working on it, and it was always lovely to act with Miles. This play was about traitors, fakes, and exposures, and it introduced both of us to Van Meegeren. So Van Meegeren is now embarking on a career as a forger, and he became an expert at forgery. He was going to nail what it meant to be a forger. Now, first of all, you have to convince people that a painting is 300 years old, okay? So these were created in the middle of the 17th century. It's now the middle of the 20th century. You've got to convince people that the painting you're trying to sell them is 300 years old. How do you begin? You begin with a 300-year-old canvas. You find some worthless old painting from the 17th century. That's your canvas, and you're going to paint over whatever that painting is. Now, that's perfectly okay, because Vermeer actually did that himself. He couldn't always afford to buy clean canvases, so he painted on top of other people's pictures. You get some worms to dig their way into the canvas to make it even older, make it dirty. You know, you can do all that stuff, and it ages it, and that's good. So you've got an old canvas. Now, what's most important is the paint, because a lot of people can paint in imitation of another painter, but they can't get the paint right. Here's the reason: because paint doesn't dry solid for 100 years. So a Vermeer painting has solid paint. It's like rock. It doesn't dissolve in anything. But if you paint an oil painting, an imitation of a Vermeer, now that paint, when rubbed with alcohol, will dissolve. So what did he do? He started to paint, Van Meegeren started to paint with gelatin glue. And that was great, because when the art experts examined the painting for authenticity, they rubbed it with alcohol, it did not dissolve. But some art expert figured out that if you rubbed it with water, it did dissolve. And 300-year-old paint doesn't dissolve with anything. So he had to do something else. What he stumbled upon was Bakelite. Now, Bakelite is like a liquid plastic. It's what phones used to be made of. And it came in a liquid form. And he realized that if he painted in Bakelite, that dried immediately if it was cooked. So he would paint a painting, a phony Vermeer, shove it in the oven, cook it, it'd come out, it was solid. You couldn't dissolve Bakelite paint. You couldn't dissolve it with alcohol. You couldn't dissolve it with water. It was undissolvable. It was perfect. The problem was he couldn't get the right pigments. It tended to turn all of his pigments gray. And remember, Vermeer had those beautiful reds, those blues, those greens, those sumptuous colors, the flesh faces, the honesty of the faces, the religiosity of the faces, and he couldn't get that. It all turned to mud. It was all gray. So he worked on it, and finally he got the right pigments in Bakelite. He baked the paintings and they were solid. And now he was ready. He was ready to paint a painting and put it on the market and make a lot of money. So what did he do? He painted what he had always wanted to paint, a religious picture. This is the Supper at Emmaus. It is a phony Vermeer. And for a long time, everybody thought it was real. Now, he was very, very clever, because look at it. You see the delicacy of gesture. You see this guy's hand? This is one of the disciples. This guy's hand on the table, but it's very delicate. Look at Christ's hand breaking the bread, very delicate. There's the window with the light pouring in, and the fabrics are very well drawn, but it doesn't really look like those other Vermeers I showed you. And this is where Van Meegeren was so clever. Now, all of the famous paintings I showed you earlier came from Vermeer's classical period, later in life when he was middle-aged. He died at 43, so they came later in his life, his late 30s, his 40s. And Van Meegeren knew he couldn't compete with those paintings. And if he tried to paint one of those, people would look at it and say, no, It doesn't look right. There's something wrong. It's a little bit off. So what did he do? He went earlier in Vermeer's life when there was no paintings, when nobody had ever found any painting, and he created a whole new era in Vermeer's paintings. This does not compare to anything because there's nothing else from this early period in Vermeer's life. People have been looking for early Vermeers, but they never found one. So Van Meegeren created them. And it made sense because Vermeer was Catholic, and his early paintings, it makes sense, would be religious. And it would make sense that they would disappear for 300 years because Catholicism was illegal in Vermeer's time. So these would be closet paintings, secret paintings. And it allowed Van Meegeren to paint the subjects he wanted to paint, religious. And this is an incredible story. This is the Supper at Emmaus. Now, there you see Jesus in blue, and he's been crucified. He's actually died, but he's been resurrected. And he's walking down the street, and these disciples of his don't recognize him. They pass him. They don't recognize him, but they say, "Do you want some dinner?" And they take him into their house for supper. And as he breaks bread, the disciples realize it's the resurrected Jesus, which means that Jesus is exactly what he told them he always was. He is a God. He is the Son of God. He has been resurrected. It's a wonderful story in the Bible. And Van Meegeren put it on canvas as a Vermeer. It was gobbled up. All the experts said, yes, that's a real Vermeer. And again, it's because Van Meegeren told them a story they wanted to hear. That's the important thing about forgery. People want it to work. They want to believe in it, right? They want to think that there's a new painting that's been discovered. And also they love the story that this was an earlier phase of his career. So Van Meegeren was going to do what he wasn't allowed to do himself. He was going to paint religious paintings because it was a Vermeer. And people loved the story. And he made a bundle off this. He made a packet and he sold it to the museum in Rotterdam. Fortunately, it wasn't destroyed in that bombing because it had been evacuated before the war could start. At the same time, the Germans started moving into France. They invaded France. And in France was the Baron von Rothschild. Now, Rothschild was a famous Jewish banker, and he had an exquisite art collection. He owned the Astronomer, my favorite Vermeer. He had it. And as the Germans approached, he knew he was smart enough to realize that they weren't going to be nice to him because he was Jewish. He would end up in a concentration camp. He would end up dead, so he fled. But he left the Astronomer on his wall. A Gestapo agent broke into his house. He found the Astronomer on his wall. He seized the Astronomer and he gave it to Adolf Hitler, head of Germany, the head Nazi. He gave it to Hitler. Well, Hitler was happy because he loved great painting. He had gone to art school. He wanted a great art collection himself. But one person who wasn't happy was his second in command. None other than Hermann Goering, the man who had flattened Rotterdam. And Goering was jealous because Goering was a cultured guy. He was much more cultured, much more refined. He was noble born. He wasn't like Hitler. He didn't come up from below. He came from the top. And now Hitler had a Vermeer and he had none. So he started looking around for Vermeer. Now, Goering had sort of a notorious war because as second in command, he was involved in everything: the persecution of the Jews, the exploitation of slave labor, the despoliation of Europe, the aggressive launching of wars against everybody. He was involved in everything the Nazis did. But most notoriously, he was involved in the terror bombings. He became famous for his bombings. The war began in 1939, and by then he was head of the Luftwaffe. He had built up the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He had made it the greatest air force on the planet. And on the first day of the invasion of Warsaw, this is what he did to Warsaw. He bombed the heck out of it. This was Goering's artwork. There'd be many pictures like this, and this, you could tell, this was the work of Goering. This wasn't a fake. This was the authentic thing. He was an artist in his own right, an artist of cruelty and destruction. And this is what he did to Warsaw. Then, as we discussed, he did the exact same thing with his bombers to Rotterdam. Here it is again, flattened, only the cathedral standing, a creek running through it, a flattened city, once beautiful, now destroyed. Now, what happened was the Germans were pushing the British back towards Dunkirk. Now, the British got to the beaches at Dunkirk. They were going to evacuate to Britain. They were going to get their army away, but the panzers were following them. Hitler was right on their tails with his tanks. He was about to get his tanks onto the beaches to finish off the British army, but Goering said, no, you don't need to do that. I can destroy the British army with the Luftwaffe, with my air force. I will blow them up on the beaches with bombs. So Hitler said, fine. We'll save the tanks. We'll save the tanks for the invasion of Britain. You destroy the army on the beach with your bombs. So Goering sent in the Luftwaffe, and they bombed the heck out of the beaches at Dunkirk. Unfortunately, what he didn't count on is when a bomb explodes, it relies on shrapnel to kill people and destroy things. It sends shrapnel flying out. Except when he dropped the bombs on the beaches, the sand absorbed the explosion, and nothing happened. He did not destroy the British army on the beaches. They got away. 330,000 British soldiers evacuated to Britain. Goering had failed. So now Hitler wanted to cross the channel and invade Britain. He got in France, he got in Holland, he got in Belgium, he got in Poland, he got in Denmark. Now he wanted Britain. He wanted to cross the channel and invade Britain. But Goering said, you can't do that, because once your landing craft are crossing the channel, the British Air Force, the RAF, is going to sink them. They will come into the air and they will sink you over the channel. And we said, what are we going to do? Goering said, I'll take care of it. I will destroy the British Air Force on the ground. I will flatten the RAF with my bombers and fighters. And he almost did. He bombed the heck out of southern Britain. He bombed, and he almost destroyed the entire Royal Air Force on the ground. But in the middle of this bombing campaign, famously known as the Battle of Britain, in the middle of this campaign, he suddenly noticed London. And he couldn't overcome his desire to flatten another city. This was his artwork. He loved to flatten cities. So he shifted his bombers away from destroying the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and shifted them to London. And he flattened London. His idea was that he would break the will of the German people. He would break their morale, and he did. But it didn't matter. He just destroyed another city. He hadn't destroyed what he was supposed to destroy, which was the British Air Force. But so because he did this again, another work of Goering's evil art, because he did this again, he let the fighters go. And the Royal Air Force survived. And Hitler realized that he could never cross the channel because Goering had failed him. Not being able to invade Britain, Hitler turned his attention to Russia, and the German army advanced all the way to Stalingrad, deep in Russia. They were trying to get to the Caucasus, to the oil fields in the Caucasus. They were all the way in Stalingrad, and the Russians encircled them. They encircled the German army. Now, General von Paulus in Stalingrad with 500,000 German soldiers wanted to break out. Hitler wanted to break in. They wanted to link up so they could hang on to Stalingrad, but Goering said no. The Luftwaffe will save you. Nobody has to do anything. I will parachute 500 tons of supplies into Stalingrad every single day, I promise. It was a disaster. He was barely able to parachute 100 tons per day. And then soon it was 50 tons, 25, and then none. And in the brutal winter of 1942-43, the German army in Stalingrad surrendered. They froze to death, and then they surrendered to the Russians, and 500,000 German soldiers went into captivity. And it was the turning point of the war because Goering had failed. And from then on, the Germans were slowly but surely losing the war. And Hitler never trusted Goering again. He was still head of the Luftwaffe. He was still the second in command, the Reichsmarshal, the second most powerful man in Europe. But Hitler wouldn't trust him with any more assignments. So he was bored. And what did he want to do? He wanted to build up his art collection, his old master's art collection. And suddenly, a brand new Vermeer came on the market. It was called Christ with the Adulteress. And in this story in the Bible, Christ says, "Who am I to judge?" Does it look familiar? Yes, it was Ben Meegeren. He had painted this. And it was so clever because once again, he said it's from Vermeer's early period, his religious period. That's why it was lost. These were closet paintings. They were hidden paintings. And there was nothing to compare it to for authenticity except his other early period Vermeer, The Supper at Emmaus. It was so clever. Now his paintings could only be compared to each other because they were the only Vermeers from that period. And the Reichsmarshal, Hermann Goering, wanted it desperately. He wanted this painting so bad. He sent for it. He sent $1 million, the equivalent of $1 million. It was the most expensive art sale in history. He got that painting. He took it to his huge estate, Karin Hall, outside of Berlin, and he hung it over the fireplace. It was the painting in his collection that he was most proud of, this painting, and he didn't pay for it. He said, "I'm not going to pay for it until I know where it came from." I want to know its authenticity, its provenance. Now, he was a very weird guy. He didn't want the war to end and anybody to find out that he had bought stolen art, which is so bizarre coming from Goering because he stole art all over the place. But in this particular case, because the painting was so valuable, he didn't want the war to end and find out that it had been stolen from somebody and sold to him, and that somebody would want it back. So he said to Van Meegeren, he says, I want to know who owned this painting. What is its provenance? Who owned it before? And Van Meegeren didn't respond. He was terrified. This was the most powerful man in Europe. Holland was occupied. If he let on at all that nobody had owned it because he had painted it, he'd be killed. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to say. So Goering, becoming impatient, sent somebody with a typewriter to Van Meegeren's house and said, you will tell us in a letter what the provenance is. Who owns this painting before? You'll tell us right now. Van Meegeren had to think fast. And he said, well, it's owned by a very old woman. And she's worried that she's going to be in trouble with the Dutch authorities for selling off such a valuable Dutch painting to Goering. So she doesn't want to say her name, but she's very old. She'll die in 2 years. I'm sure of it. Until then, I will take full responsibility. I take full responsibility for the provenance of this painting. I do. And in 2 years, when I'm sure she'll be dead, I will tell you who the owner was. And Goering fell for it. He fell for it completely because he wanted to believe. He wanted to believe that he could buy this painting. And he gave the $1 million to Van Meegeren. And it was the biggest art sale of all time. And the provenance had been proved. $1 million had been earned. Van Meegeren, without anybody knowing it, was becoming the richest artist on the planet because he was working his trips. Things were going well for Van Meegeren and for me. By 2007, Miles was my go-to actor. He always did well on my shows. I would write him anything. If I wrote a show, there was a big role for him in it because I loved working with him. He was so dedicated. He could sing, he could dance, he could do tragedy, comedy. He could cry on stage. He could laugh wildly. He was a brilliant actor. I was so lucky to have found him. And then in 2007, something happened. And it was sort of a signal of what was going to happen in the world soon. Maybe the first signal that I was aware of, although I didn't pick up on it. He was fired from his day job. Let go. Yeah. They had cutbacks. He hadn't done anything wrong. They just couldn't afford to employ him anymore. And it was weird because he said he didn't care. It didn't matter to him. His day job had never mattered to him. That's not what he lived for. He lived for theater at night. He worked during the day to keep himself going, but what he really loved was doing theater at night. And I thought, well, that's might not be true because he was so dedicated to that job. He said he loved the people he worked with. He loved hanging out with them, talking to them. I even visited him once in the office. I could tell that everybody loved him. He was accepted there. And also he was very dedicated to the job. He never missed a day of work. I used to ask him if he could rehearse during the week. He always said, no, I cannot rehearse until 5:30. I have to work a full day. And even on some weekends, he said he wasn't available because he had to do extra work for which he was not paid. He just volunteered to do it. So he was very dedicated to his job. So when he was let go, when he was given leave, he said he didn't care, but I think he really did. I think he cared deeply. Even though it was just purely economical, they loved him. They didn't want to let him go. He just didn't have any seniority. I think he was deeply hurt by that. I felt bad. So I said, well, why don't you come and work at the theater? You can work part-time at the theater. You can be the assistant artistic director. I really value your judgment. I think you do great work in the rehearsal hall. You know that. I think you're great on stage. I think you'll be a great help in the office. And Miles said, yes, I'll come and work part-time. And I was hoping that would buck him up a little bit, make him feel like, you know, he was useful still. Yeah. And then something weird happened. We were doing a play about Iraq. It was about a drag queen in Iraq. And I was on stage playing this colonel in the US Army. And I was on stage with this very statuesque drag queen. And we were getting drunk. And we were drinking from a vodka bottle. And every night we have drinks from this vodka bottle. And it was just a prop. I mean, it was a real vodka bottle, but it just had water in it. And we would get drunk. And then after the scene was over, we put the prop backstage. Well, one night, the actor playing the drag queen got stuck on the wrong side of the stage for half an hour. And there was no bathroom over there. So he peed in the prop vodka bottle. Well, I came off stage after the show and here was this vodka bottle full of piss. And I said to the actor, I said, what is this? He said, oh, I got trapped back there. Isn't that funny? Ha, ha, ha. I said, this is our prop. It's full of piss. I said, okay, I'm just going to go wash it out. He said, don't wash it out. I don't want to drink out of a bottle that was full of piss. And I said, was your piss? He said, I don't want to drink anybody's piss. Don't wash it out. I said, well, then why did you piss in it? He said, just get another vodka bottle. I was so annoyed. I mean, okay. So I asked Miles if he could go across the street to one of the bars and get an empty vodka bottle. Yeah, simple enough. Just go ask a bartender just for an empty vodka bottle. Well, next day, Miles, my hero, always helping out, always doing things right, showed up with a beautiful vodka bottle. It was empty, but it was really a high-class stuff. I was like, that's great. Did you get it from a bar across the street? He said, no, I just bought it on the way home from work last night, and I just drank it myself. A full bottle. He was drinking again, and a lot. I'd never known him as somebody who drank. And I said, oh, well, how's that going? You're drinking again. Is that okay? He said, oh, yeah. I just don't let the vodka control me. I don't let the liquor control me. I control it. I'm like, okay, well, if it's working for you, you know best. And I kind of thought, wow, the economy has hit this guy in a way I didn't even anticipate. Was the jig up for him? I couldn't tell. He seemed normal enough, but he was drinking a lot. For Van Meegeren in Holland in 1945, the jig was up because the war ended and the Nazis had been pushed out of Holland, and now the Dutch were back in charge, and they were rounding up anybody who had collaborated with the Nazis. And Van Meegeren was considered a Nazi collaborator because he had sold a brilliant piece of art, a Vermeer, part of Holland's patrimony, to a Nazi. He was considered a collaborator, a traitor. He was a Nazi collaborator, and under Dutch law, that made him a criminal. For us, the jig was up with the collapse of the economy in 2008. Suddenly, everything was going south. The city cut its funding to the theater to less than half of what it had been. The federal funding stopped. The state funding stopped. Individual donors stopped giving money to the theater. Now, a lot of them were on fixed incomes because they were retired. And they said their stocks did not yield anything anymore. They had nothing more to give us. And I used to take them out to lunch. I called them on the phone. I'd buy them tea. But they said, we can't help you. Some of them gave a fraction of what they give. And I said, thank you. Anything you can do. But I could see that they were desperate. And there was very little money coming into the theater. And that's when I saw a lot of people become desperate. I never saw behavior like I'd seen when that economy went south. I'd never seen anything like that before. I've been through terrible economies before, but always as an employee, never as a manager. And suddenly I saw behavior I could never expect because people were desperate. They were losing jobs, they were losing money, and their behavior changed. They became completely different people. It was an amazing period, scary. We had a bookkeeper. Now, this bookkeeper had been hired by the board. I had had nothing to do with the hiring. And they said, she's good. You're going to like working with her because she knows what she's doing. And she showed up for her first day of work. And she turned out to be a Christian fundamentalist. I don't think the board knew this. She was a Christian fundamentalist who hated gay people. She hated homosexuals. I thought, oh my God, I have to work with this person. But she was good with the books. So she never came and saw the shows. We never talked about what the theater did to make money. We just focused on the books. Well, she kept things going by working with us part-time, and then she had 2 other jobs. Well, both those jobs in this new awful economy went south. They went down. They let her go. And she had 1 part-time job, and she was desperate. She was desperate for money. She approached the president of the board. She said, I have to have a meeting with you. He came down to the theater. She went into the office with him. I went in too. I didn't know what was happening. She said, you have to pay me more. You have to pay me a full-time wage. You have to take me on full-time. And she had never said anything to me. And I said to him, I said, well, wait. First of all, it's a part-time job. Secondly, we can't afford to pay her full-time. How am I going to pay Miles? How am I going to pay the actors, the designers, the box office person? How am I going to pay anybody? We can't afford to just take on a full-time bookkeeper. She said, I need this money. I've lost my other jobs. I desperately need this money. You have to take me on full-time. And the 2 of us were begging him to go our way. And he stood up and walked out of the office. And she chased him down the hall. She was that desperate for money. And I was desperate too. I ran out a back door. I ran down the sidewalk and I headed them off at his car. And the two of us were pleading with him. She wanted money for herself. I wanted money for everybody else who worked at the theater. I said, yes, we'll keep her on part-time, but we can't pay her full-time. Please, please, please. I have to pay all these actors. She said, I need the money. I need the money. He got in his car. He drove away. People were desperate. He gave her the raise. Additionally, we had two big donors and they suddenly stopped giving us money. I called them up. I was very friendly. I said, I just want to check in, see how you're doing. I took one of them out for drinks. I took another one out for lunch and then for tea. And I just talked to them calmly. I said, I know this is a bad time. They said, it's a horrible time. We have no money, no income, nothing. And I said, no, I understand. Can you give something? Can you give half? Can you give a little? They said, no, we can give you nothing, nothing, nothing. They were panic stricken. They looked hurt. And I said, don't be hurt. No, you're a friend. You're a friend of the theater. Don't worry about it. Well, I found out what really happened later. A much larger queer organization had gone to the first one and convinced him to give all of the money that he gave to various organizations to them that year because the economy was so bad. He also willed them everything. So when he died a few years later, they got everything from him. They had actually gotten so desperate. This was a much bigger queer organization. They'd gotten so desperate that they told him he had to give them everything. And also in his will. This much bigger development department had buried me. And the second donor, the same thing happened with him, with another queer organization. They buried us. It was every man for himself. They had money, but they've been told they have to give all that money to the bigger organization and in their wills. It was horrible. Other queer organizations were turning on our tiny one. I didn't make any judgments. I knew that these guys meant well and that they'd just been backed into a corner. Somehow somebody had said something that had convinced them to turn away from us and give everything to these big organizations. It was a crisis that gave me rare insight into historical events. Now, I don't pretend that this was as bad as the German invasion of Holland, but in a disaster, I realized that these are the dislocations that happen, the separations. It was a real wake-up call. And Miles, who is now working in the office and acting in the plays, he turned from being one of the kindest men I'd ever worked with to being a surly drunk. For a solid year, he was an ever-increasing nightmare in that office. He was awful to work with. And I knew he had not been this way before. I knew it was because he was drinking. He was late. He was late finishing assignments. He didn't finish them correctly. And when I talked to him about it, he denied it and he got angry. When I asked him for suggestions about things, artistic suggestions, business suggestions, he made fun of me. He abused me. He belittled me. It was awful working with him. I tried to keep adjusting the way I approached him, but I was always in the wrong. I was always wrong. It was never him. It was always me. Working in the office became a trial, late, lying, belittling, abusive, and I just took it. I took it. I was codependent. I was so used to him being nice to me. I didn't know how to deal with him not being nice, so I thought it was my fault. And my creative work with him was sabotaged. He was unfocused in rehearsals. He wasn't off book when he was supposed to. He never knew his lines on time. He was undirectable. If he didn't like direction, which was most of my direction, he made fun of me. He belittled me. He ignored the direction. If he took the direction, he forgot it the next day. If I gave him direction on Monday, on Tuesday, he had forgotten it. I had to remind him, and then he got angry at me, and he was drunk at rehearsal. I'd grown up around that, around booze, and I slipped into my role as a child. I kept deciding it was my fault. I had to work harder. I had to figure out how to communicate. I had to keep adjusting the way I said things. I had to be more complacent. I had to let things slip. I slipped into my old role as a child. It was all my fault. And then we were asked to take a play to New York. It was a play that we'd done here and it had been a big success, great press. It had been written up in Variety. And we were asked to do the play in New York City. And we were excited. And it was a two-hander play and I did it with him. It was me and Miles, just the two of us. And we rehearsed for a few weeks to get the blocking back. And then we were going to take a week off to learn our lines again because we hadn't done the show in about a year. So we'd get refreshed on the lines, and then we'd come back with the lines memorized and have a week of run-throughs. So we had that first chunk of rehearsal. We went off for a week. I learned my lines. I came back. First day back, 1 week to go before he went to New York City. He didn't know his lines. He had not studied them at all during vacation when we were away. He wasn't ready. He'd been drinking that week, the whole week. And he didn't apologize. He just said, I didn't know him. And I realized that I would have to drill the lines into him because in a week we'd be in New York in front of serious people. And that's all we did that week was a line drill. He wouldn't learn his lines outside rehearsal. All he did outside rehearsal was drink. So that whole week we just drilled lines, drilled lines, drilled the lines. There was no acting. There was no work on blocking. It was just drilling lines, drilling lines, drilling lines. And at the end of the week, we got on a plane and flew to New York. And the whole way to New York, we drilled lines on the plane. We just ran the show, ran the show, ran the show. And when we got to New York, we kept running the show. And he was just barely off his lines. He was just barely focused. But he was serious. It had been a week where he had been serious because I think he was afraid. He suddenly realized he'd be in New York. And even though he couldn't control his drinking, he knew that he needed me to get him off book. So he realized he needed me to get him ready for New York. So he was serious. He did what I told him. And we kept running the show. We kept running the show. And at 7:30 for an 8 o'clock curtain, we were still running the lines backstage. We ran a scene. I said, okay, at 7:30, I turned my back on him. We need to go get ready. And then I turned around and I said, Miles, could we run one more scene? And he said, John, enough, enough. There was all the rage that I'd seen in other rehearsals, and it suddenly came back. He was furious. And I walked away. I decided to just leave him alone. So we performed the show that night and it went really well. We got great reviews and it could have gone better. It could have gone much better, but I was satisfied. We got through it. The audience loved the show. The reviews were great. And I think what had happened was he got completely freaked out. And he stopped drinking that week. He completely stopped drinking that whole week. And I think in the back of his head, he was thinking, it's the drink, it's the drink, it's the drink. And he knew in the front of his head that this was our opportunity, that if the show went over well enough, that a producer would pick it up and put it into a theater in New York City for a longer run. Well, the irony was that that's what motivated him to sober up, but I knew that wasn't going to happen because of the economy. I knew that nobody was going to pick up this show because of the lousy economy. We got great coverage. The audiences loved it. The people who brought us there loved it, but it went nowhere because of the economy. But he stayed sober. I was impressed with that. The show could have been a lot better, but he got through it. He stayed sober all week. So we came back, but he didn't stay sober back in San Francisco. First day back in the office, he was supposed to show up at 1 o'clock. He showed up at 1 o'clock. I was in my office. I told him, come on in. I wanted to talk to him about how well I thought New York had gone. I felt it could have gone better, but I wasn't going to say that to him. I just wanted to say, good. I feel like we're heading in the right direction. Good. We got some of the old magic back. I wasn't going to be specific. I was just going to lend my encouragement. He came in, he sat down. He was drunker than I'd ever seen him. Another thing we were going to talk about was headshots, and he was picking up headshots, and he said, oh, this guy, I love this guy. He's so sweet. And he started to pet the headshot delicately, giggling to himself. I'd never seen him this drunk. He was almost falling down drunk. He'd been drinking probably up until the moment he walked in the front door. I couldn't take it. I didn't know what to say. I had no idea. I just was defeated. So I decided to go home. As I left, I walked by the box office, and the box office manager said, hey, what's going on with Miles? And I just shrugged my shoulders. I don't know. I didn't want to say anything. And she said, sad. It's so sad to see him that way. I went home, defeated. I did not unleash my wrath on him. I didn't see the point. He'd escaped my wrath completely, although I'd been a victim of his for months. Then Meegeren had escaped Goering's wrath right? He'd escaped the wrath of the Reichsmarshal, but he was not going to escape the wrath of the Dutch. He was a victim of his own success. He had created a masterpiece by Vermeer, and then he'd sold it to the Nazis, and now the Dutch were going to have his hide. He'd sold a priceless treasure, this valuable Vermeer, this unique Vermeer from Vermeer's early period. He'd sold it to the Nazis. And collaborators, Nazi collaborators in Holland at this time were being beaten, they were being starved, they were being murdered. And Van Meegeren knew his time had come. The jig was up. He was arrested. He wouldn't talk. He was locked in jail. He wouldn't talk. He wouldn't say anything. Finally, after being questioned for weeks, when he was about to be thrown to the sharks, he said, "I'm a forger. It's not a real painting." It's not real. It's not real. I was frustrated by the critics and the art world. I was frustrated that the art world felt such indifference to me. The art experts, they didn't take me seriously. So I got revenge. I duped Goring. I duped the art world, and I got revenge. I have duped the art establishment, and I duped the Nazis, and it's all for revenge. And everyone loved that story. Van Meegeren was telling another story, and everybody loved it. They loved it. They loved that he pulled a fast one on the Nazis, on Goring. They even loved it that he pulled a fast one on the art establishment, because people in Holland were very suspicious of the art establishment, because the art establishment had turned its back on many great painters. Van Gogh had never been taken seriously by the Dutch art establishment in his lifetime. It was only after he was dead that he was taken seriously. He went crazy. He might have killed himself. He was so insane. He cut his ear off. He was so frustrated. And the art establishment had never taken him crazy. Vermeer himself had never been taken seriously by the art establishment. His paintings were worthless until the 19th century, only then. And even Mondrian, a contemporary of Van Meegeren, had to leave Holland, go to New York to get established. So the Dutch were suspicious of the art establishment anyway, and they loved that he had duped them. He was suddenly a folk hero. He went from being the biggest villain in Holland to being the biggest hero, because he duped Goering, he duped the Nazis, he duped the art establishment. He did one very weird thing at this time. He divorced his wife. He loved his wife. I mean, he cheated on her all over the place, but he loved her. He divorced her, and he continued to live with her, and he continued to love her. But why did he divorce her? Divorce a woman you love? It didn't make any sense. At the theater, from now on, it would be tough love. I decided when I got home that that was it. I was going to go into the office and I was going to crack the whip. I was furious, personally furious, professionally furious, furious in every way. I was angry at what Miles had done. I went in the office, I typed up a letter, I printed it up. And when he walked in, and he was sober and he arrived on time that day, I pushed the letter across the table. It said that he had been drunk the day before, and this was his first strike. One strike, he would get 2 more strikes. 3 strikes, he was out. I would fire him for cause. And I said, sign the letter. And he said, you're right, I was drunk. Good, sign the letter. He signed it, and I put it in my drawer. And that was it. I was no longer going to take his abuse. I was no longer going to listen to him belittle me, make fun of me, ignore me, come up with excuses. I wasn't going to do it anymore. I castigated him every single day. I was on his case all the time. If he turned in something late, I got angry about it. If it was wrong, I made him do it again. If he even suggested that I had an idea that he didn't think was 100%, I said, don't talk to me that way. Don't you ever talk to me that way. That period between us is over. We are done with that. You treat me with respect. If you can't treat me with respect, say nothing. And don't you ever come into this office drunk again. Stay at home and I'll write you up. And I was tough as nails. I was vicious. And I hated every moment of it. It was just revenge, because he'd acted that way. Suddenly I got to act that way. It felt awful. And I did encourage him to take action. I said, look, you've got insurance. You can go to a farm. You can dry out for 10 days. Then you can get into AA. You can stop this drinking. You can control this. Why don't you take control? But I never encouraged him. I was always yelling at him about it. I was so angry. I was like, this is in your power. Take control. Go to a place to dry out. Go into AA. And he said, yeah, I'm looking into it. I'm looking into it. I said, don't be so wishy-washy. Take care of it today. All he did was yell at him about it. Meanwhile, we were losing money. The theater was losing money all over the place. And then the critics turned on us. They started saying the shows were terrible. And they weren't. They were fine. They were fun. We put on this huge musical. They said it was junk. They thought it was silly. We put on this lovely show about two lesbians, one from Central America, one from the United States, who were separated by the United States government. They said it was boring. I was like, how can you say that about this wonderful, beautiful play? The critics turned on us. And I felt like a sick dog on the sidewalk in this horrible economy. And the critics were kicking me as a sick dog. I kept telling Miles to take action to solve his problems. His friends were useless. A lot of them were drunks or drug addicts or unemployed. I knew they weren't going to help him. I was supposed to help him. I was furious at him. He'd let me down on stage, off stage. He yelled at me. He abused me. I felt so defeated by him. And so all I could do was get angry at him to take action. Tough love, tough love. That was going to be the solution from now on. And the weird thing is, it was so weird. It seemed to work. He seemed to appreciate it. He got better. He didn't come into work drunk anymore. And I knew that he was drinking at home. I knew that he was drinking every night. I knew that he was hungover in the office. He looked terrible, but he was trying. And he was always nice to me now. On my birthday, he gave me a present, and I knew it was a friendship offering, a book, and I unwrapped it. And there it was. The Man Who Made Vermeers, unvarnishing the legend of master forger Han van Meegeren. It was a book about Van Meegeren. And he was hearkening back, Miles was hearkening back to that play we had done where we talked about Van Meegeren in the play. And he was trying to remind me of a better time between us, trying to say we can be friends again. And he included a card with the book. I unwrapped the present. I looked at it. I looked at the card. And I could just barely say thank you. And then I walked out of the office. I was furious. I was furious that he had invoked this magical time between us, this great experience we had putting on this play. I was furious that he had invoked that at this moment, at the lowest point in our friendship. I was furious that he would invoke that. I never read this book. I was bitter about this book. I put it on my shelf and I never read it. I never read it until the beginning of last week when I started preparing for this project. That was the first time I opened this book and read it. I was so angry about how it was presented to me. And the card, I didn't want to read the card. Was the card going to have an apology in it? It was too late for apologies. Was it going to invoke our great friendship? We didn't have a friendship anymore. We had the remains, a disaster of a friendship, the dislocations of disaster. Was he going to say that he liked me and he felt bad? I didn't want to hear any of that. I felt that this card was more abuse. I didn't have the charity in my heart to appreciate these presents, this friendship offering. Look, the card has never been opened. Can you see that? The seal is unbroken, never opened. At the end of this performance tonight, I'll open this and read what it says. I hated my reactions. I hated the way I was behaving. If that's how he had treated me, there was no excuse for it. I hated the way I was behaving. And why couldn't I help him? Why couldn't I help him? Why couldn't I take him under my wing? Why couldn't I take him to see his doctor or his insurance people, get him into a program? Why couldn't I take him to an AA meeting and sit with him the first few times? Why couldn't I tell him, call me anytime, day or night? Let me be your sponsor. Yes, I was married. I was a happily married man. I didn't have time for these disturbances. I wanted to enjoy my life at home with my husband, who I'd been with my whole life, who I'm still with. I wanted that to be my focus, but why couldn't I give a little more of myself to help this person who I once respected so much and so admired as a friend? Why couldn't I help him? I refused. I didn't have it in me. In my view, he was a fake. He was different. He had changed and I couldn't accept it. He was a fraud. He was a forgery. And I couldn't help him get back to something that I knew or something new. I couldn't do that. Van Meegeren was brought to trial. He had to be brought to trial because he had committed crimes. He had committed crimes. Yes, he committed outrageous crimes against everybody. So he had to be brought to trial. Even though people were amused, even though they were amused by what he'd done, he had to be brought to trial. And he was a star of the trial. He did magnificently. First of all, he had to prove that he actually forged these paintings. So what did he do? He got up there and he painted a new one, a brand new one. This is Christ in the temple, painted for the trial. And there is Christ in the temple. Look familiar? Yeah, it's from Vermeers' early period. The early period that only Van Meegeren knew about because he was the one who painted it. And there are the figures. They look just like the other two paintings, exactly the same. And there's Christ. There's Christ, and he's pointing at a Bible. What a clever trick, because of course, Christ never pointed at a Bible. There was no Bible in Christ's time. The Bible was about Christ. That was his witty joke. And he painted it so that he could be seen painting it. And here he is in front of the courtroom, painting it. There he is, painting Christ in the temple. And the courtroom was his gallery. They hung it with all of his forgeries and all of his own paintings. It was the greatest gallery show he ever had, and it was packed. And it wasn't just in the gallery, it was all of the world. Everybody was following this. Everybody loved this story of the guy who'd gotten revenge on the art experts, the guy who'd tricked the experts with Bakelite, the guy who had duped the Nazis, duped Goering. They loved the story. It was on the cover of the New York Times. He was a hero, a complete and total hero. And he had done it all for revenge, which everybody loved, on an unappreciating art establishment. But had he done it for revenge? Had he really just done it for revenge? The prosecution didn't think so. They thought he'd done it for money. And the prosecutor said to him, he said, "You admit, though, that you sold pictures for very high prices, don't you?" And Van Meegeren had the best response. He said, "Oh, I could hardly have done otherwise. Had I sold them for low prices, it would have been obvious that they were fakes." People loved it. They were endlessly amused. He had won the trial. We were embarking on our own trials in the office. Miles had cleaned up his act. He was still drinking, obviously, but he wasn't drinking around me. That's all I cared about. But the holidays, I think, were especially rough on him. And as we got closer to Christmas, he showed up one day drunk at the office. I said, "Are you supposed to be here?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Remember our rule. If you're not supposed to be here because you're drunk, you're not supposed to come in. Go home." He said, "You're right. I'm not supposed to be here." He went home. Next day when he came in, he was sober. He arrived on time. I typed him up. I pushed it across the table. I said, "There it is. Your second strike. Sign it." He signed it. I put it in my drawer. 2 strikes. You got 1 more. We had a New Year's Eve show. We had a headliner lesbian comic. I put Miles in charge of the lesbian comic. He was drunk on New Year's Eve backstage. He was abusive to her. He said nasty things to her. She came to me. She said this. I observed him do it. I went up to him. I said, "Go home. You're not supposed to be here." He went home. The next workday after New Year's, he came in. I pushed the letter across. It said he'd been drunk at work. It was his 3rd strike. I told him to sign it. Sign it. I took it. I put it in my drawer. I said, "Go home." I was going away out of town, so I sent him an email saying, "Please turn in your keys to the box office." He replied, "Ooh, drama." Obviously, he was drunk, but he dropped off his keys. When I got back from being out of town, I called him up. I said, "You are fired for cause." It was the first and only person I have ever fired. And it felt terrible. I couldn't believe I'd done it. And I felt so satisfied. And I talk about how desperate people get in a lousy economy, how desperate he got, how desperate the bookkeeper, how desperate the funders, how desperate the other organizations. How desperate was I to do that to him? The weird thing was, it was only after I fired him that he cleaned up his act. He got himself into a program. He started going to AA. He got himself another job and he started acting other people's productions, which he hadn't done in years because he'd been acting only in mine. But now he started acting with other theater companies and he was never drunk at their rehearsals. And I thought, what a miracle. And couldn't I have accomplished all that without being so nasty and cruel? Just because he'd been nasty and cruel to me, couldn't I have accomplished all that? Wasn't that the lesson of authority, to rise above it? Shouldn't I have helped him? Could I only accomplish it by cracking the whip, by firing him? Couldn't I have taken him in? Couldn't I have taken him to AA? Couldn't I have made myself accessible? Could I only achieve it through being tough and cruel? Then Meegeren was found guilty. He had to be found guilty. Everybody loved him, but he had to be found guilty because he had actually sold a painting to the National Museum, the Rijksmuseum. It was the foot washing, the woman washing Christ's foot. Now, this wasn't even a very good one. Look, you can see, even by his standards, it's kind of awful, but it was on the market. The National Museum didn't even like it. They weren't even sure that it was real because it didn't match up with the other early paintings that he'd done. It was really sloppy, but somebody was interested in it, and that person was Goering. Goering, again, was interested in buying it, and the National Museum of Holland had to outbid him. Otherwise, they would lose another painting to the Nazis. So they bought it. That's not what Van Meegeren wanted. He wanted to sell it to Goering, but the National Museum ended up buying it. So he had accidentally ripped off his own country. So he had to be found guilty. Well, those are the breaks. The National Museum had bought it, so he was found guilty. But people were still amused. They thought that was funny. What an accident. He never wanted to sell it to him anyway. Everyone was so amused by it. But it meant that he would have to have all of his money confiscated, everything. The government would take all of his money. Well, of course, they couldn't take that much because when he divorced his wife, he made sure that she had most of the money. He still loved her, he still lived with her, and the government got very little because she had the millions. He was very clever. It was safe with her, the woman he still lived with. Well, he was given a 1-year sentence. He could have been given much more, but he was given only 1 year, and he never served it because he died before he could go to jail. He cheated the jail. Interestingly enough, he died from a heart attack, which they think was brought on by venereal disease. He should have listened to Barnes. He should have used Barnes's cure for venereal disease. Hermann Goering was brought to trial also. He was tried at Nuremberg for war crimes, crimes against humanity, for looting the art of the world, for his treatment of the Jews, of slave laborers, for launching aggressive war. He was an evil, evil Nazi, and he was going to take the fall at Nuremberg. There were 24 defendants at Nuremberg, and Goering was offended by the other defendants. He said, they are nobodies. These people are nobodies. I'm the only somebody here. I'm the only one who made any decisions. These people, I've never met most of these people. They certainly aren't important. There are only 4 important people in Nazi Germany: Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, and me. I'm the one, the only one who should be on trial. His perverse vanity wouldn't let him let it go. He still had to be the star. Well, he confessed to everything. He said, yes, I did it. I'm guilty of crimes against humanity. I'm guilty of despoiling art from all over Europe. I'm guilty of persecuting the Jews and the slave laborers. I'm guilty of launching aggressive war. Yes, I did it all. But I'm guilty of the crimes. I'm not guilty in this courtroom because this courtroom has no jurisdiction over me. In a weird reversal of what Christ had said to the adulteress, Goering said, who are you to judge me? Who are you to judge? He said, I'm guilty of the crimes, but I'm not guilty in this court. He would not accept their judgment. Well, they passed judgment anyway. The French, the British, the Americans, and the Russians. He said, you have no authority over me, but they passed judgment anyway. He would be hung for his crimes, hung until he was dead. He said, I'm a soldier. I'm a Reichsmarshal. I'm the head of the Luftwaffe. I shall be shot like a soldier. They said, no, you will be hung like a common criminal. Well, Goering, one of the most evil men in history, cheated the executioner by swallowing poison the night before his execution. And they think that it was given to him by an American officer. And I think about all these disasters I've been talking about and the dislocations, the outrageous behavior they inspired in all of us. But Meegeren, Miles, the funders, the government, the Nazis, Goering. Yes, there's huge differences in the magnitude of these crimes, but that's what disaster does. And I see us living through a disaster right now of plague. And I wonder, will we keep our humanity in the midst of this as it drags on forever? Will we remind ourselves we don't have to be cruel? Will we learn those lessons? Will we become desperate and do desperate things? Will we become forgeries of ourselves, fakes? Will we let ourselves down as I did? Even as I judged people for being desperate in 2008, I became desperate and cruel. Here's Miles's letter to me that came with my book. I'm now going to open it and finally read for the first time what he said to me. What I wouldn't allow myself to read at the time. It's a beautiful card. It's Mount Fuji. The greeting in the card says, sending you warm wishes for a wonderful day. Happy birthday. And Miles has written, wishing you a great one and many more. Love, Miles. And I never realized this, but it's signed by the rest of the staff. And they've all written lovely little notes to me. And I never knew that because it was handed to me by him. I just relied on assumptions and I assumed it was from him. And I was just going to punish him by not reading the book, by not opening the card. And consequently, I'm just realizing it at this second. I never thanked everybody else who contributed to this present. I never said thank you to anybody because I was too stuck in my stupid world of hate and desperation. Look at this, it's incredible. I expected it to be a note just from him. It's a note from the entire staff. And I never knew that. And that truly is one of the wages of desperation. 12 years ago, a group of people gave me a present, and I never thanked any of them because I was too wrapped up in my own stuff to realize that it didn't just come from him. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been The Scammer by Meegeren and the Dislocations of Disaster. I appreciate you joining me this evening. We have been presenting live performances on Zoom and Facebook Live since the beginning of Shelter in Place. I've been doing a solo performance every week since the beginning. This is my 20th. And I couldn't have done it without you, the audience. Thank you so much for supporting me and for being here. I feel very weird at this moment saying this, given what I just found out, but once again, the theater is struggling. And if you'd like to make a donation to our theater to support programming like this and other programs moving forward, we'd certainly appreciate your support. You can do so by mailing me directly at that address there, John Fisher Theater, Rhinoceros, 91 Central Avenue, Suite number 102, San Francisco, California, 94117. Or you can visit our website, therhino.org, and donate on the donate button. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure performing for you tonight. And here's a prayer that we can all retain our humanity in the midst of this disaster. Thank you and good night.